Speaking of wars, let's head over to the U.S. and the battle that continues to rage over there. Now, this particular war, well, it's not being fought with guns and mortar, but through the media and the mounting mountains of evidence stemming from the Russia investigation. You know, several weeks ago, I said things just can't get any crazier with what's going on in the U.S. White House and President Trump. Then the next week, I said, well, it can't get any stranger than this week. Well, now we just finished this past week, and I seem to be running out of words to describe the current state of things. So let's just say things are getting crazy strange. Let's just quickly go through the list of characters in this continuing saga of the U.S. president. First up is Jeff Sessions, who we talked about many times. He's the guy who was the first senator to endorse Donald Trump for president. He was his good buddy through the whole campaign, and after Trump won the presidency, he named him the U.S. Attorney General, even though he was kind of a racist. Now Jeff has had a tough time being the Attorney General. During his Senate hearing, he kind of forgot or maybe lied that he had met with the Russian ambassador, and so he had to recuse himself from the investigation into the Trump campaigns colluding with Russia to change the outcome of the election. We all know this because we talked about it many times here on the Jam. He had to do it because he really had no choice. But this week, in an interview with the New York Times, the U.S. President Donald Trump said, if he had known that Jeff Sessions was going to recuse himself from the Russia investigation, he would have never picked him. He said, what Jeff Sessions did to the president was very unfair. That's Trump basically talking about himself in the third person. He said, Sessions should have told him that he was going to recuse himself before he offered him the job. But of course, how could Jeff Sessions have known that he himself was going to become part of the Russia investigation and therefore have to recuse himself? The problem that Trump is having now is that special prosecutor, Bob Mueller. He's looking into Trump's financial dealings and his income tax report, something that Trump does not want anyone to see under any circumstances. He has been fighting that from day one to make sure that no one can look into that stuff. And now this guy Mueller is looking into everything that Trump holds so secret. The problem is that Trump can't fire the special prosecutor because the prosecutor is under the Department of Justice, which is run by Jeff Sessions. But Sessions can't fire him either because he has recused himself from the Russia investigation. So Trump really needs Sessions to resign so he can get another guy in there and get rid of this prosecutor that's looking into his dealings in Russia. But then in a bizarre twist this week, after the president said he was very unhappy with Sessions and that Sessions should have never recused himself and seemed to be setting Sessions up to resign, Jeff Sessions turned around and said he's not going to resign and that he will stay on as Attorney General. Now, I know this all looks very bad, but what has become obvious from all of this, especially after Trump's interview with the Times, is that by saying that Sessions shouldn't have recused himself, and that by doing so, now Trump no longer has the power to impede or stall or change the path of this Russia investigation. People are asking, why on earth would Trump open himself up like this? And why would his lawyers allow him to talk to the New York Times? Of course, the issue being, did the lawyers even know he was going to talk to the New York Times, or did he just kind of do it on his own? Now, in another bizarre twist, it just came out that the ambassador of Russia was overheard in an intercepted call talking to officials back in Russia that he and Jeff Sessions on several occasions discussed issues about the campaign and what Trump's views were going to be on certain Russian issues. Now, Congress wants to question Sessions again on how many times he had meetings and spoke to the Russian ambassador and what exactly did they talk about. So, what is Trump going to do now this guy Mueller is subpoenaing his records from the IRS, the Deutsche Bank, who loaned him hundreds of millions of dollars, and is looking into all his dealings all over the world? Well, here's what Trump's going to do. Here's what he's doing. He's got his team of lawyers together, and they're going to look into finding some dirt on Bob Mueller and his team. Trump has instructed them to find conflicts of interest, anything they can find to discredit him and his investigation. Also is having his lawyers look into the possibility of President Trump being able to give himself a presidential pardon. So no matter what his crimes that Mueller finds on him, he'll be immune to it. He's also having do this for his own family, most notably his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his daughter, Ivanka, which are both now open to prosecution because of a number of things, including Jared not giving truthful answers on his security clearance forms. You know, things like, did you meet any Russians, etc., etc. Speaking of meeting with Russians, remember the story last week about Donald Trump Jr. and the meeting he had with the Russian lawyer to get information on Hillary Clinton to use against her in the campaign? And then he went on Fox News and said, "I've told you everything there is to tell on the Russian meeting." Well, it turns out that he didn't tell us everything. Well, this week there's yet some more stuff that is spilled out of that meeting. Turns out the Russian lawyer that he met with had a company client that turned out to be the Russian FSB. You know, that's the spy service in Russia that took over for the KGB. Also, originally Don Trump Jr. said there was 4 people in that meeting, but later it turns out that there were really 8 people, including a Russian-American political operative / former Russian military officer, as well as being a Soviet counterintelligence officer. But the big question was, who was the 8th person in the room? Well, now we know who that was. His name is Ike Kavalazda. He's not just some random Russian guy. He's actually best known for being the subject of a congressional probe in which foreign nationals were laundering money through U.S. banks. He started up thousands of corporations in the U.S. on behalf of Russia and opened American bank accounts for them to launder some $1.4 billion through the banks. He did this in order to circumvent the Russia's strict currency laws at the time when corruption, bribery, theft, asset stripping were prevalent in that post-communist Russia. Now, this guy's lawyer just got a call from Bob Mueller. And he said that now he's being investigated by the Office of the Special Prosecutor, partly because of his partner, who had very close ties with the KGB. Now, all this comes just after the G20 summit in which Trump had his secret closed-door meeting with Vladimir Putin. But what is just so unbelievable after that meeting was at the dinner when all the world's leaders, everybody was sitting there at the thing, and then Trump got up and left his chair to go sit with Vladimir Putin and talk about something else. What did they talk about? No one knows, because Trump didn't bring a translator or an aide or a consultant or anyone. Of all the people in the room that you would go and talk to for over an hour, he went and talked to the one guy that is under the most scrutiny. The guy that's causing you to be investigated in about colluding to cheat in the election. Then supposedly there was yet another secret meeting that no one knows about. So why is this such a big deal? Well, when the President of the United States speaks to another world leader, there's almost always a record of that conversation in case something was said that needs to be analyzed by the staff and the lawyers. Even if it's secret talks, there's always someone in the room, especially when it's a U.S. adversary like Russia, who, by the way, is also an adversary to almost all the other world leaders who were watching this conversation between the two and wondering, what are they talking about? Is Trump telling him our secrets that we shared with the U.S.? When they asked Trump, why did he go over to Putin, he said, so I was seated next to the wife of Japanese Prime Minister Abe, and she's a terrific woman, but doesn't speak English, like not hello, which actually is not exactly true, as it turns out that the wife of the Prime Minister does speak English. So things just keep getting stranger and crazier as we keep stirring the U.S. political pot. This week marks Donald Trump's 6 months in office, and now the pundits and media are trying to analyze and break down what he had accomplished and what he has not. One of Trump's biggest promises was to keep manufacturing in the U.S., to make sure that U.S. brands are indeed made in America. So this week was touted as Made in America Week. The concept was to showcase 50 different brands in the U.S., one to represent each state. Trump had a grand celebration at the White House as he walked around tables of American-made stuff, checking things out, such as swinging an American baseball bat and fake driving a fire truck. Trump said, we don't need Chinese products. The stuff that's sent over from China is, well, it falls apart after a year and a half. It's crap. But the funny thing is that none of Trump-branded products, such as his men's suits, ties, or sunglasses, were at the celebration. The reason for that is that most of Trump's clothing line is made in China. He also has some made in Bangladesh, Honduras, and Vietnam. Also, none of Ivanka Trump's line is made in America, nor his vodka, which was produced in the Netherlands. Most interesting is his Make America Great Again hats, in which Trump swears that they were made in America. However, it turns out that the hats were made by immigrants from Mexico and El Salvador. And if you were to buy a hat now, mostly it would probably be a knockoff from China. But let's take a quick look at the first 6 months, minus that Russian scandal. Trump said that he had accomplished more in the first 6 months than any other president in history of presidents. But it's been kind of hard to ask him about his accomplishments because he refuses to call any press conferences. So far, he has only had one press conference which turned out to be a bizarre debate in which he called CNN fake news. Also, the press secretary, Sean Spicer, who had some of the most insane arguments with the press, stopped having on-camera press briefings altogether. And this week, well, he finally resigned. But let's take a look at some of the big stuff. So far, Trump signed into law 42 bills, mostly repealing Obama-era regulations on things like banks and the environment, naming a memorial and encouraging flag flying. But as far as major legislation such as health care, tax reform, or infrastructure, he's still sitting on a big donut. He hasn't been able to get one piece of legislation through. The ironic thing about this is that Trump is a Republican, and the Congress is all Republican, and the Senate is all Republican majority. It seems like this is the best situation that Trump could ever dream of, yet so far he can't get anything accomplished. The problem so far has been that most of his ideas are simply bad. He wanted to build a wall to divide Mexico from the U.S., and this was his biggest promise. But even his closest allies backed away from this. Trump said Mexico will pay for it. Then he said the U.S. will pay for it, and then Mexico will pay us back. Then it's not going to be a wall, but rather a fence. And then it will have solar panels and pay for itself. And now more recently, it will be a see-through barrier so that we can see what's on the other side. Just so many ideas that are not even his own people will back. Then when he tried to make a travel ban on Muslims, he found out quickly that the court in the U.S. have the power to stop him on things like that. Then his tax reform plan that basically helped Trump giving himself many tax breaks and people like him, or the Trump Care plan to repeal and replace Obamacare, which recently died its third death as it did not get through the Senate. The problem with being that the plan will leave 23 million Americans without health care. The Trump people have tried to spin this in every which way, but the Republicans know that if they pass this bill, they will most likely not be elected ever again. And what about overseas and his diplomacy objectives? Many have said that it seems Trump does not have a good understanding of foreign relations. However, after his trip to Poland, he said, "I have had the best reviews on foreign land. So I go to Poland and make a speech. Enemies of mine in the media are saying it was the greatest speech ever made on foreign soil by a president." But after his trip to Poland, he went to Germany to the G20 summit, in which he opposed the world on almost every subject, including trade deals and most notably the Paris climate deal, in which he pulled the U.S. out until he could renegotiate it. The rest of the G20 members reiterated him that the deal is non-negotiable. One of the most outspoken people at the G20 summit was the French President Macron, who suggested to Trump to make the world great again and vowed to change Trump's mind on climate change. Trump later went on to meet Macron in France. During his interview this week in the Times, Trump said, "We had dinner at the Eiffel Tower, and at the bottom of the Eiffel Tower looked like they could have never had a bigger celebration ever in the history of the Eiffel Tower." I mean, there were thousands and thousands of people because they heard we were having dinner. Trump goes on to say about Macron, "He's a great guy, smart, strong, loves holding my hand. People don't realize he loves holding my hand. And that's good as far as that goes. I mean, really, he's a very good person and a tough guy, but He has to be. I think he's going to be a terrific president of France, but he does love holding my hand. Now, Trump didn't mention anything about the climate accord. But what Trump is truly remembered for in his first 6 months are his tweets. Never before has a president communicated with the public in such a way. Some people have said, this form of communication is perfect for the president. You are limited to the amount of words you can use, so he doesn't have to write out his ideas, just 1 or 2 sentences. And most importantly, there's no one standing in front of him to debate him. So far, Trump has sent out 991 tweets, 22 mentioning Hillary Clinton and 45 tweets to criticize Obamacare. But the interesting thing of the one is the 82 tweets mentioning fake news. Trump has been able to blame many of his issues and problems on the fake news media. He's taken the phrase fake news and has changed the definition of it. Before, it was used to describe social media content that was completely untrue and put out for the reason of swaying people to think negatively to someone. But now it's basically anyone who disagrees with the president or writes something contrary to his views or statements or says anything negative about him, that's fake news. One more thing Trump is best known for in his first 6 months is his blatant hypocrisy. Even the smallest things. He consistently tweeted about Obama always playing golf and always on vacation, never spending any time at the White House. Yet, he has spent more time, more of the taxpayers' money on his vacation in 6 months than Obama did in his entire tenure as president. 21 out of the first 26 weekends he spent vacationing on his property. He started a council to look into fraud, that he was going to get to the bottom of all this voter fraud. Although just after taking office, Trump settled 3 fraud lawsuits against Trump University for $25 million. I guess I could go on and on about the small stuff, but of course, going into the next 6 months, what matters is the really big stuff. Over and over, Trump said that the Iran nuclear agreement was the worst deal ever. But since taking office, his advisors have convinced him that removing it would be much worse. In regard to the Wall Street banking regulations, which Trump hates and wants to end, including the Obama financial regulations on banks to protect customers, well, so far it's been able to survive in place for now, and the U.S. economy is stable. And what about North Korea? Every time Trump draws a line in the sand, North Korea steps over it. But so far, no one has started any wars yet. Over the rest of the year, we will be watching all these issues, as well as the roller coaster that is the Russian investigation. Could we predict what will happen in the next 6 months in the U.S.? And for that matter, the world? If the past 6 months is any indication, then the answer would most absolutely be no. This is Eric McCain on DZRJ. We're on the jam here, talking about things going on around the world. We'll be back in a few minutes. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back to talk about some sports, and tech, and some health issues, and some very interesting stuff. So please stay with us and come back.